So I was asked to come this afternoon, thank you all for filling up the seats, and talk about my decades out here as working as a green architect. And I thought, oh, okay, let's start here. I happened to take a trip to Spain and down on the Costa del Sol, and I was told about a retired English boilermaker who had made a solar hot water collector. And would this be of interest? And I said, sure, I'm going to be in that neighborhood anyway. And I went up there, and I go to get out of the car. I see the property right away because I can see something like this. What you see on the screen is really an American system. In southern Spain, where the insolation, the amount of sunlight and sun energy is so tremendous, the tank need not be insulated. So I come out of the car, I see the tank and the collector by its side, and the Englishman behind, and I walk up and I'm saying, hello, hello, and I'm going to reach out and touch the tank, and he yells, no, don't touch the tank. And it's too late. I touch the tank, and I burn my hand. And that visceral experience is what put me on the road to saying, why are we throwing this away? This is amazing. It's powerful stuff. I go back home, and we're in the middle of the oil embargo. Some of you here are old enough to remember, but most of you not. And there were lines of cars at all the gas stations. Gas was rationed. And people taking cans of gas, and people shooting each other with guns over protocol about where they were on the line. So this was very serious stuff. And we called it the energy crisis. It was born then. Although I must say, Rachel Carson was talking about this in the 50s. Right? And this morphed into what we know today as climate change concerns. Now, climate change is occurring because we are modifying the atmosphere of the Earth. When that light energy hits a solid surface of the Earth, or you, or your house, it turns into long-wave energy. I'm an architect, I need the graphics, right? It works for me. And the long-wave energy finds the atmosphere relatively opaque. So it's trapped. Now we have heat energy trapped inside the blanket, the atmospheric blanket, and the Earth is warm, and we have life on Earth thanks to Mr. Sun. The Victorians loved this. And it coincided with the spread of capitalism all around the globe and to their introduction to exotic plant materials, which they had never experienced before. The people who were sent out to recover some of these things, that was the expedition of the Beagle with Darwin's first trip. Take these exotic plants, bring them back, and we will grow them in our greenhouses because they found that glass had similar properties to our atmosphere. It is relatively translucent to shortwave light radiation and relatively opaque to long-wave heat energy. So knowing that, so this is a diagram of passive solar. Very simply, there aren't two suns, there's really one sun, but I'm showing it on the slide in the summer position and in the winter position. And in the summer, it's blocked by, let's say, in this case, the roof overhang. And in the winter, the sunlight is admitted into the building. The building is an insulated envelope, and it has one magic secret, very important ingredient, and that is what we call thermal mass. It's a material that is dense, and by being dense, it has high capacitance. The highest capacitance we assign, 1.0, is to water, and other materials are fractions of that. And this dense material allows the sunlight to heat it up, and it gets stored in the material. And then at night, when it's cooler in the building than the storage material, heat always flows from warm to cold. It radiates back out and heats the space at night. It also prevents the space from overheating because we're only collecting the sunlight maybe 6 hours a day of the 24 in the winter when we need it. So at the time that we're collecting it, we have to collect 3 to 4 times more energy than we need at that moment to put it into storage so it'll work for the other 16 or 18 hours that we're not collecting. So the thermal mass prevents us from overheating when we're taking in far more energy than we need to heat the building at that point in time. Right? So we built many of these buildings, some scratch entire buildings. This is an addition to a 18th century older building that's in the background on the left side of the screen. And you can see the elevation, the south-facing elevation, is articulated in depth. On the right side is an interior view. You can see how the windows are stepping out. And the diagram on the left and the middle show that at every level of glass, in the top level, we have calculated or shown the angle of the sun for both winter and summer so that the glass is exposed to the full sun in the winter and it is shaded from the full sun in the summer, and the building is shaped the way it is to allow that to occur correctly for each level of glass. Otherwise, if we had a wall as tall as that, which is 16 or 18 feet, I believe, then you would have to have an overhang going way out about 6 or 8 feet, and then you would have inefficient use of the glass because in between full shade and full aperture, you would have this half-shaded time, and the glass would not be working well for you. So breaking it up into levels like louvers, the principle of louvers, enhances the efficiency and makes the building cheaper and easier to build and far more effective. We need a really good thermal envelope. We talked about this. The thermal envelope that I use are structural insulated panels. These are panels as large as 8 feet by 24 feet. They're huge. It could be a whole wall of a building, or you stand them on end and they'll go up 2 stories. And these panels are consisting of skins, structural skins of a plywood-like material, oriented strand board, and fastened with adhesives to rigid foam cores. And the cores keep the skins from buckling, and therefore they can accept enormous in-plane loads, which they do. So these buildings are not only much more efficient in terms of insulation, but they're also superior in terms of structure. And we are in a hurricane zone, 130-mile-an-hour wind zone, and these buildings do so well, we don't need any of the metal strapping that's found on the usual stud construction. So they have high R values, and the most important feature is that since they're large panels with hardly any joints compared to the thousands of joints in a conventionally built stick structure, the air infiltration is very, very, very low. And on most buildings, what I call a code minimum building out of conventional construction, half your envelope loads and losses are due to infiltration. So infiltration is misunderstood and not given the importance, like our friend the tick, that it should have. So these are how we build very efficient envelopes, and we build the efficient envelopes because all this is about load control. The tendency to think about how we're going to take modern technology and apply it to architecture to solve our problems is that we're going to create lots of power efficiently somehow with some material, and we're going to push it into the building and satisfy its energy needs. That's called supply-side thinking, and it's tremendously inefficient. We start with demand-side thinking, so we control the amount of energy that we need. We try and make the envelope so terrific that you need very, very little energy to make the thing work. Okay? And that's true with cooling as well. So here's another building. If you can see it, and we're proud of the fact that it's difficult to find in the landscape. This is the staff quarters for the National Golf Links right up the way here. And it's sort of like a dormitory for the people that work on the golf links. And we were assigned, we got the job because I've done underground buildings, and the board of directors said, oh, we don't want this to be visible. We want to bury the whole building because it's right by the second tee, and everybody's going to see this and see the people who work there, and we don't really prefer that. And I said, there are certain laws and codes that require windows and light and ventilation, and we think it's proper to treat human beings by giving them light and ventilation. So I said, but what we can do is we can make the building very organic in its shape, and it will blend into the landscape, and it turned out to work that way very successfully. On the right of the screen is a construction photograph, and you can see the rafters, and they are 18 inches deep, which we needed for structural reasons, but we also used that and filled that 18-inch cavity solidly with cellulose insulation. And the building really performs very beautifully. It also has an air floor. This is my small contribution to the profession. We all know about hydronic radiant floors, where there are pipes buried in the concrete or under the concrete or under a wood floor. And we send hot water through those pipes, and the pipes create a warm surface. The heat in the liquid transfers to the surface becomes a giant radiator, and we get warm, comfortable heat from that, which is terrific. I say nothing against it. But in our climate, especially now with record summer temperatures for the last 5 years, we have hit a tipping point where the humidity and the temperature out here pretty much demand air conditioning, or I prefer to think of it as just dehumidification, because otherwise we turn our buildings into mold factories. So it becomes a health issue. When I first came out here in the early 70s, that was not the case. In other words, just in my half-lifetime, we find evidence here of the climate change that is impacting the industry. About 10% of all new houses out here had central air back in the early 70s. Now every single house, it's 100%, has central air. So you're building two separate heating systems or cooling, two separate systems, one for heating, one for cooling. That's expensive. So the air floor combines that into one distribution system using air, and it has the benefit during the heating season of capturing the stratified warm air that rises up to the top of the ceiling, and that's where we place our return duct, and we draw that back down and below and charge the slab underneath. So it's any extra internal gain, if you have a fireplace, a stove, if you have a party, you got 10 people over dancing, that will heat the building. So we're on the track now to making the buildings, now we call them green. When I started, we just called them solar buildings or energy efficient buildings. And the language has changed considerably, reflecting our concerns about green, making buildings that are benign to us and the environment, and sustainable. And we can see that it's easy now for us to get these buildings to be what we call net zero buildings, and you use very little energy. So by doing that, controlling the load, working on the demand side, we find that that's the smartest thing to do. Keeping the building small. Always start with the smallest building that you need, and then instead of the biggest building, the bigger buildings are going to require more energy. Here we see on the top the rooftop view of this same building, loaded with over 10 megawatts of photovoltaic cells. So I'm thinking about this and thinking, yes, I want to make the best community that I know, and I want to help to make really good communities on the East End for everybody to enjoy and live in and thrive in. And then I'm thinking about am I doing that by making each individual unit the best I know how, making it a net zero house or even maybe a positive flow house, positive energy flow house? And the answer is no, because what we're really looking at in terms of a community is the aggregation of all these buildings. We're looking at the built environment. And the built environment is only as important, it's only important for the reason that it is the armature of our civilization. It's the armature, we hang on it, it supports our social life, our cultural and economic lives. And aside from that, it's an interesting artifact. And it is a record of our culture. That's why archaeologists look at the buildings, look at the built environment to tell you what life was like in that society. But greening the unit doesn't correspond to greening the community or greening the whole system. In fact, it's possible that it can be very detrimental because we encourage people to do that, and that's what our zoning system out here does. We have a suburban settlement pattern, and it encourages people, and we are not encouraged, we only are allowed to build our buildings on the lots that the zoning ordinance tells us we can build on. 2 acres, 3 acres, 5 acres, 10 acres. So we are putting these things, we're spreading them out all over the landscape. We're destroying the farmland, right? And this is what we have with suburbia, and therefore we necessitate the construction and maintenance of a tremendous overstretched utility system at all levels, for communications and for transportation. And it fragments our communities. The chances of having meetings, when we have our breaks, the idea of talking to someone you never met before, of having that chance encounter and profiting by it, everybody profits by it, and discovering who your neighbor is. There are people who are neighbors out here for years and they never talk to each other, never meet each other, because you get in your little car, your steel and glass shell, and go down the road. So we have to work for a society that's different than that. If we take the suburban model, and we could see every unit therefore demands its utility backup. In this case, I'm showing you the waste system. This is innocuous, it's passive, there are no moving parts, and it handles the waste not as well as it should, incidentally. That's another topic. But when we take this and we put it into the pattern, the suburban pattern, then this is what we really have. And then you can see how silly and stupid this is. We really should handle this collectively. We should have a collection system. And the same thing is true with many of the other issues that only come into existence because of the diffuse settlement pattern of suburbia. And so we're handling things individually that should be handled collectively. And when I first came here and from New York City, which is where I was born and raised and went to school, I had to figure out what this whole zoning thing was about. I go down to the zoning office and they tell me, well, we've divided this little landscape up into parcels, and the parcels are certain sizes and the uses are prescribed. But in some places we have overlay districts. Okay, that sounds all right. And what is this one over here? And I point to something on the zoning map, and he says, well, that's the agricultural overlay protection district. Oh, that's great. That means that we can't build any houses where they're farming. No, it doesn't mean that. Here's a shot of the zoning map of the town of Southampton. The blue dot in the center is where my little office is. And you can see that overlay district taking up the whole slide, right? And yet all of you can see parcels that are cut up representing 1, 2, 3 acre parcels. And many of you who have driven around this area know that there are houses pretty much all on there. But you may not know that Bridgehampton loam, which is a soil classification type and is predominant in the outwash, the glacial outwash that we have here, is one of the best growing mediums, not just on Long Island, not just in the United States, but in the world. And now we grow houses on it. And it's difficult to build the house there because you have to put your footings all the way down below the loam. So in the face of stupidity, we do even more stupid things, right? So we have this wonderful landscape, and this is what we're doing to it. And again, I'm crying because it's not just what it looks like, but how does it work for us in terms of our day-to-day living? You know, it's pulling people apart. It's fragmenting us on all these levels rather than putting us together. So I love open space as much as the next guy. The trouble with open space is that it implies that there's no functionality associated to that space, and also that no one is responsible for it. But we give so much attention to the built environment that we divide it into all these different categories, and we have all of the mountain of regulations about what each category is and how it works. And yet we don't treat the space in between the built environment with 1/10 of that concern and understanding. This is Germany on the screen, and if you fly over most of Europe, in fact, if you fly over anywhere most of the rest of the world, this pattern of the village with a clear boundary in the middle of what I call a managed landscape is the model of building, of living for thousands of years. And it was, ironically enough, the model that we had on the East End and the South Fork when we first came in 1620, right? And we've proceeded to go in an opposite direction that, again, I say, destroys community. This is Galt in southern France, and it's built on a hill. So you build your village on the place in the landscape where it's most difficult to farm. And you look at the slide, you'll see farmland in between the hills. Sensible, right? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon or a rocket surgeon, right, to figure that out. And the other thing about living in these villages is that when you're in these villages, you look out through the streets and you have a tremendous sense of being located in a rural landscape, a truly rural landscape. That was in France. This is in England, a small village in England. And it's not because I'm standing close to the edge, like 3 blocks or 4 blocks from the edge of the village. The village is small. Every place is 4 blocks from the edge of the village. Very quickly, we have some amazing maps that were developed. They're drawings that were developed by the Regional Planning Association founded in the 1920s by Lewis Mumford. This is their work of 1991. And on the left, you see pretty much as in 1991, what Long Island, and on the right side is Connecticut's screen. We are bird over Block Island, looking back. And you can see the quote, open space is coded green, and the developed space, the built environment, are coded brown and very densely black, right? The next slide in the center shows, following along the path of existing zoning regulations, this is what we will look like. And if we change that, if we change our zoning, then we would have the alternate on the right. If we look at that up close, as we were in 1991, and current zoning build-out would deliver us this, and alternate build-out handling the same number of people, same population. So the word out here, that's a dirty word, it's not a 4-letter word, but it's much dirtier out here, is density. Density has nothing to do with it. Density has nothing to do with it. It's the pattern of development that is critically important, right? So in order not to wind up with dystopia, what do we have to do here? We have to change the process by which we design and build, and which means that we have to involve the user, the legislative people, the design and build, the construction community, and come together and discuss how to do things. Right now, we're all fragmented. We're not even allowed to talk to each other when this kind of planning is going on, when we're going to make decisions about how do we decide how to build in our landscape. We just have a few planners in a municipality making those decisions. And nobody consults the user. So certainly nobody consulted the Shinnecocks. Right? All right? What else do we have to do? Well, we're going to change our zoning for sure. And then we should even change how we pay for these community services, which go to paying for utilities. Why do we pay for school tax? Why would we pay for our schools with a property tax when we pay for everything else with an income tax? Right? And we also have to do what we're doing right here now. We have to initiate community discussions about these issues and then explode the myth that we live in a rural community and examine all conceivable alternate models. And finally, you're glad I'm getting there, right? Every proposal must pass the quadruple test for, people, planet, and profit, or I've also heard it, economy and environment, and I forget the fourth E, three E's, and mostly it's about culture. What do we really have when we strip away everything else? Again, when we go as archaeologists and look at past societies, we look at what was their culture, what was life like, and we want to provide built environments and use our landscape to enhance and create a vibrant, equitable, that was the third E, equitable life for everyone. And it takes place on foot. Don't forget that. Thank you very much. All right.